Theodore Roosevelt, at your service.
Teddy, can you get us out of here?
Can't do it, man. This is your moment.
Will you save the lectures, please? I'm not you, okay? I didn't build the Panama Canal. I wasn't president of the United States. I need some help. Come on.
Hi there, and welcome to Baseball by Design. I am SportsLogos.net minor league baseball correspondent Paul Caputo, broadcasting live, as always, from the Sunday Helmet Hall of Fame in my basement in Fort Collins, Colorado. Today we're going to be talking about the Double-A Frisco RoughRiders. I'll be speaking with designer Jason Klein of the design firm Brandiose. I will be speaking with President Roosevelt himself, the Colonel, and I'll be speaking with living history interpreter Joe Wiegand. And of course, Dan Simon will be here with one of his studio Simon Stumpers. Right now, I'm so pleased to be joined by Scott Burchett, who is the general manager of the Frisco RoughRiders, has been with the team since 2004. The current role that Scott has is general manager, but has been around for a long time. Scott, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
I'm going to start with a really basic question. What's a Rough Rider?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So the roots of our original logo and a team name came back from Mandalay Sports Days. They owned several different minor league teams throughout the country, and John Spolstra, kind of a sports marketing wizard at the time, really was the brains behind the original name. And here in Frisco was old cattle country, and there was basically the Shawnee Trail ran right by the ballpark. So he originally actually wanted to name the team the Drovers, believe it or not, which was the folks that drive the cattle up the cattle trails. But after just I guess workshopping and discussion, they ended up with Rough Riders, and kind of our original logo was more of an old Western motif with a horse and rider on it.
Yeah, well, that switch has been pretty important, right? The switch from the sort of more generic Rough Rider character to one who is specifically Teddy Roosevelt. And there's some, great. We're going to talk to Jason Klein from Brandiose. We've had a lot of characters swinging bats from Brandiose over the years, but this is one with Teddy Roosevelt himself swinging a bat. Obviously, Teddy Roosevelt has a history with the Rough Riders, himself. What is that story, and why is it important to, Frisco, Texas?
No doubt. So when we rebranded the team in 2015, we really wanted to go back to what the core of the Rough Riders are, which is Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders who rode in the Spanish-American War. A lot of those volunteers that participated in the battle actually came from the North Texas area. So we really wanted to honor them and come up with something that kind of fit there, the historical ties and the baseball ties as well. So we collaborated with Brandiose and started that whole kind of creative brainstorming process. And Jason and his whole team were great to work with. Went through many rounds of iterations and designs and brainstorming. And we kept coming back to really that historical, Teddy Roosevelt, and bringing him to life. I think they really nailed it as far as the minor league baseball logos go. It's whimsical, it's fun, but at the same time, it's classical as well. And I think it's one of those ones that's going to age well over time.
So you were with the team in 2015 when this rebrand happened. Mm-hmm. Was it obvious to the local community what the significance was of switching from this, I don't want to say generic, but this very serious Rough Rider on a horse, head down, is the sort of old-timey clothes flapping in the wind as he's riding, right? And then here's sort of portly old Teddy Roosevelt swinging a baseball bat. What was that connection obvious to the local community? How was that received?
Yeah, it was certainly obvious to some, but at the same time, we were pretty careful with the storytelling behind it as well, and just to get the word out about why we're doing it and how we're doing it, and just all the details that go into making up a logo. We were very particular, for example, with the color scheme of the logo. It's red, white, and blue, typical of an American flag. But our thought process was, that's more of the colors of the American flag that sit out and baked in the Texas sun. So all those colors are a little muted. So instead of a really bright red, it's more of kind of a scorched burnt red. Same thing with the blue. It's a little muted and darker. And then we don't have any whites in our logo either. So all of the whites in our color scheme are a nice cream color. So if it's kind of faded over time. So that's just one example. But we went through the entire storytelling of Teddy Roosevelt and his connection here to the community, just to really put a bow on it. So there's a connection between the brand, the team, and the logo.
Sure. I'm just going to read a little bit from the article that I wrote back in 2015 about the team. I said, on July 1st, 1898, the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry charged alongside other military regiments, most notably the Buffalo Soldiers, into the bloody Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba, helping to deliver a decisive blow in the Spanish-American War. With Spanish troops retreating and ultimately leaving Cuba shortly after the battle, the U.S. would declare victory in the war just weeks later. The 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, which was commonly referred to as the Rough Riders, was led by former Assistant Secretary of the Navy and future U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. History remembers the Volunteer Cavalry as a hodgepodge band of outdoorsmen, ranchers, cowboys, Ivy League athletes, Texas Rangers, Native Americans, and others, many of them from Texas. They would see action in 2 other battles, but it was their role in the charge up San Juan Hill in support of Cuban independence from Spain that has become the stuff of legend. So that was, a lot of that wasn't like obvious to me as a baseball fan, for sure. I mean, that history, right? Like the connection of Teddy Roosevelt to the Battle of San Juan Hill, and maybe I'm showing my ignorance here, but that wasn't obvious to me. Is that a part of the culture in Texas? If I grew up in Frisco, would I just know that story by heart instead of having to read it from an article that I wrote?
Yes and no. It probably more so than other parts. But at the same time, we did have to take some efforts just to educate our fan base and be able to tell the story. So if you walk around the ballpark and you go into, certain areas, we have different motifs of Teddy Roosevelt and military garb, military uniform, showing all the cadets from that time. We have the famous picture of him on a bull moose. That was one of his nicknames as well. Riding through. It's actually one of the first Photoshop jobs ever done, by the way. Him on the bull moose. That wasn't a real picture if you go back and read the history about that. But to your point, we have had to tell that story and be able to educate our fan base. Of course, people around here grow up, reading about the Alamo and Texas history.
Sure.
Not as much on the Spanish-American War, but it probably is a little bit more in the common vernacular than maybe other parts of the country.
Sure. So minor league baseball being what it is, the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry was called the Rough Riders. That's Rough Riders, 2 words, capital R with a space in between. Obviously the team, 1 word, but still with 2 capital R's. It's an interesting distinction to eliminate that space as just sort of part of the minor league baseball vernacular. Is that ever part of a conversation? Do you ever talk about, should it be 2 words instead of 1?
We did when we went through the rebranding stage, but honestly, not much since then. It's I wish I had a better answer for you, but it's kind of the way that we've always done it, and I think that's what our fan base is used to, and that's what our fan base is used to seeing. So we did change a whole lot in 2015, so it was nice to kind of keep the same team name in the same way that they've seen it, just to connect the 2 eras together.
Sure. So the Rough Riders are a Double-A affiliate of the Texas Rangers. Texas Rangers, better than I do. What is it, a 20-minute drive to get from ballpark to ballpark?
A little bit more than that. It's probably 45 minutes to an hour.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, and DFW traffic can be quite a bear sometimes, so it could be more than that depending on what day you're trying to go out.
Okay. But the Rangers, their name is obviously rooted in the local history as well. Does that strengthen the connection between the Rough Riders and their parent club, that both have sort of this historical context to their nicknames?
Yeah, I think so. And a lot of the teams around here obviously have more of that old kind of Western origin of their logo. When you look at, Texas Rangers, Dallas Mavericks, obviously Dallas Cowboys. So I think we fit right into that and kind of the history and the culture of what defines DFW.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, one of my favorite features, this is not related to the nickname. I'm sure you get asked about it all the time. I have never gotten to be in a lazy river at a baseball game. The lazy river obviously is a huge part of, I don't know if it's part of the brand of the team, but it's certainly part of the brand of the ballpark and the Rough Riders experience.
Yeah.
What was the thinking in putting a lazy river. I mean, obviously people who are in the lazy river aren't paying real close attention to the game. What was the thinking in putting a lazy river in the outfield?
Well, we had a pool. It was more of a residential style pool out in the outfield. You've seen those at some other ballparks. Arizona's had one for a while. Round Rock has one down there. It did really well. It sold out. So when Chuck Greenberg, our owner, bought the team, we started some ideas and some just brainstorming on how to renovate the stadium and how to maximize the fan experience. And one of the things that we brought up was basically adding a second pool. The first one was so popular, let's add a second one. Well, as things typically go during the creative and brainstorming process, that pool kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger to where it basically took up all of right field, which coincidentally is the hottest part in the ballpark. As you know, in Texas can get quite warm during the summer. So we wanted to take, what could be seen as a negative in some eyes and turn that into a positive, because when it's hot outside, you enjoy being in the pool and swimming around. So it ended up being a massive pool stretching pretty much all of right field. And then during a meeting one day, I don't remember who originally brought it up, but all of us kind of at the same time said, hey, let's make it a lazy river. And I'm so glad we did, because it made it a unique feature, and it's such a cool place to watch a ball game. I think Chuck puts it well when he describes it as kind of that new roller coaster that Six Flags might have, where not everybody gets to ride it, but everybody talks about it. So it certainly is a focal point, something unique, and certainly that makes our ballpark different. We're really proud of it.
How do you get to be in it? Is it a special ticket, or can you just, do you wait in line? How does one get to participate in the lazy river?
Yeah, it is a special ticket. We have to do that for a variety of reasons. First of all, code, because you're going to have so many people in the water at one time. So we sell it to private groups 5 nights out of the week, and then on Thursday it's a 21 and up party as part of our Rowdy at the River, where Frisco turns into I guess a light Vegas for the weekend, and then Sunday's our family day out there, to where you can buy a single game ticket, and all for one price you get access to the game, the lazy river, and the whole experience.
The family day is sort of a recovery day from Rowdy at the River, I guess.
It might be. Usually different demos and different crowds out there, but it's kind of all things for all people, and it's a lot of fun. And we have a heater on that thing, so even in the April and May, early May, when it's a little cooler, we can heat that up as hot as we want to, make it probably the world's largest hot tub. But then after that, when summer hits, it's a nice place to cool down throughout the Texas heat.
When you guys were playing at Dr. Pepper Ballpark, which was the former name of the ballpark, I just had this vision of the lazy river being filled with Dr. Pepper, and I could picture myself on a floaty with a big straw on a river full of Dr. Pepper at a baseball game, and that sounded amazing.
It's not a bad thing at all. And actually, when we were going through the whole launching of the lazy river, I can find the information and send it to you. But we did the math on it with how many 12-ounce Dr. Peppers would fit in the lazy river itself, just as some of the marketing material, just some of those wacky stats out there that were eye-catching.
I would love to know the answer to that question, actually. Yeah. I have one last question for you before I let you go here. Obviously, I think throwbacks are really popular these days. You've got a lot of teams sort of reprising old brands. This team, before it moved to Frisco, was playing in Shreveport, and they were the Shreveport Swamp Dragons, and they had this very like 90s logo, lime green with a dragon, a swamp dragon holding a baseball. One of these ones that like desperately needed to be changed, but now like looking back in retrospect, it's would be a really fun sort of retro brand. Do you guys ever think about trotting that old brand out on a retro night?
We have discussed that, and that might be coming down the pipe here in the next couple of years. This year is all focused on our 20th anniversary.
Okay.
So every Sunday we're bringing back our original Rough Rider uniforms with our Sunday Reds and the old horse and rider cap. But nice. I think that's a great idea, and that might be something that we'll be considering in future years. Have you done the deep dive down the Swamp Dragons logo tree with John Spolstra and the New Jersey Nets story?
No, I haven't. That sounds like a great idea for an episode.
It is a great one. It is fascinating. From my understanding, John Spolstra, I mentioned earlier, who was one of the executives at Mandalay Sports, our original owner, one of the ones that named the Shreveport Swamp Dragons. He had it all lined up to rename the New Jersey Nets the Swamp Dragons. Back in the 80s, before David Stern stepped in for the last minute and said, no, you can't do that. So as far as logo stories goes, it's a pretty good one.
That is definitely going to be worth exploring. I've got to start looking into that. That's an awesome fact. Scott, thank you so much. I really appreciate you hopping on with me this morning. Where can people find you? Where can people find the team online and on social media?
Absolutely. Look us up on ridersbaseball.com, or you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, anywhere you peruse social media. Would love to have you out at the game this summer.
All right. That'll be in the show notes, and I can't wait to get to a game, and I'm definitely going to buy a ticket to the Dr. Pepper Lazy River.
Awesome. Love to have you out.
All right, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so pleased to welcome back to the show my friend of Baseball by Design, Jason Klein of Brandiose. Jason, how are you?
Yeah. This is going to be a fun one.
This is a fun one. This is a little bit different. This logo was a little bit different for you guys. This was a historical character come to life. Teddy Roosevelt is the foundation for the Frisco RoughRiders. Creating a logo based on Teddy Roosevelt must have been fun. I mean, looks like, just looking at the logo, it looks like it was fun.
Yeah, and this brand on the surface feels very straightforward and very sort of clean and major league. And it had more rounds than you would imagine. It was, I mean, the first was the first thing we realized, because they had gone there like sort of black and they were red and it was very hoarse. And the reason, if you're not familiar, but the reason that the RoughRiders became the RoughRiders was because Teddy Roosevelt had this group, the RoughRiders, and they were in Texas supporting the Texas Rangers. So Chuck Greenberg, who's a good friend of ours, and he had, we'd worked with him in State College and Myrtle Beach. He was like, "Hey, Jason, I really want to go major league on this. Like, I really want to go like a major league brand." And I felt like, I was like, "Chuck, man, we got to like do Teddy Roosevelt. Like, this is great. Like, it's the namesake. It opens up the story." So we explored a lot of different concepts. I mean, there was some horse stuff in there, but ultimately it was, sort of very like Texas and rangery and like, the Rough Riders. And so lots of concepts, early concepts explored the horse, but we realized at some point, like, nah, it just wasn't it. So there's all these questions about like, where are the lapovers between Teddy Roosevelt, Texas, and baseball? And we knew like we could get this like image of Teddy Roosevelt. And so we had there's an iconic image of him where he's laughing. And I think it was when he was the president, but he wasn't a Rough Rider then. But so the image, the actual logo, his face is as close as we can get to his presidential laughing smile, but he's wearing the slouch hat from his Rough Rider days. So, but boy, we went back and forth on tweaking little things to like, can we make it look like Teddy Roosevelt? Can we make, what are the colors going to be? The slouch hat was tan. So we felt like, oh, we're going to have some tan in there. What is the relationship with the Texas Rangers colors? Could we do Texas colors? So sort of red, white, and blue, but then you have tan. And the other element was his nickname was Bull Moose. And so we had this idea of like, could we have, I think there's an image somewhere. I have it in front of me. I don't know if it was like a doctored up, but it was like Teddy Roosevelt, like in Life magazine, riding a moose maybe. Okay. And so we were like, oh, that should be it. It should be like him riding a moose. And we had these early concepts of him like it was a bucking bronco, but it was like a moose. Right. And like him riding on it. So real fun, sort of keep dialing it in. We started getting into like cream as a color. There weren't a lot of teams with cream uniforms. So we're like, let's do cream uniforms. Kind of gives that old school, Teddy Roosevelt era baseball, the Texas Star dotting Frisco and Riders. The belt buckle continued at some point. Like I said, the Teddy riding the moose dropped off. The swinging character, and at some point we were like doing swinging characters. This point, the swinging character served a purpose, which was like we wanted to like signify it was an MLB sort of identity. And if you're like, well, how do you get MLB but also keep a character and fun? Swinging Friar, Mr. Met, Mr. Redlegs, and then you have the swinging Teddy.
Absolutely. Well, and then the swinging character and the smiling character are great, right? Because you're talking about how do we identify that this is actually Teddy Roosevelt? And
Yeah.
I mean, were there
Yeah.
things that were sort of specific to you that you said, we got to have this to make sure people see that it's Teddy Roosevelt?
Yeah, and this was it has to be a quick read, right? You have to look at it and go, that's Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And you have to do it in a way that's really simple because it's not a painting, it's a logo.
Right.
So you have to have what are the quick reads that are going to register? In a lot of ways, and this happens a lot, our collective memory of what we think an object or a person or a thing looks like may not actually be what the real thing looks like. So if you try to design off the real thing, it feels wrong.
Right.
But if you take these sort of stereotypes of what something looks like and you sort of lean more into that, it reads quicker. So for example, when we got into and now we're getting into the weeds, really trying to dial in, how do we make it? Yeah. So we had a picture of Robin Williams from Night at the Museum. We had, paintings of Norman Rockwell's paintings of Teddy Roosevelt. And we have a Teddy Roosevelt bobblehead. And so we're looking at, and these are all really characters if you think about it, right? They're not photos, they're movies, they're bobbleheads, they're paintings. They're what does the world think about? And not just the presidential one, because there's a sort of presidential black and white version, but we have the slouch hat. So you're okay, we knew the monocles. The monocles are a big thing. The mustache was going to be a big thing. Also, this this collar that wraps around your neck. And the mustache too, right? I think we looked at it with brown mustache. And then it just didn't feel right. And then it wasn't until you get a white mustache on there that you're oh, okay, this feels like Teddy Roosevelt. But you're wait a second, the white mustache was from the presidential, or not, yeah. And then you're okay, you got to go back. And so you're trying to figure out, I think we ended up on the brown mustache. But it was what color mustache do we associate with it? And and what is realistic versus, what is realistic Rough Rider versus realistic presidential? Yeah. The slouch hat being an Australian kind of element. And does it feel too Australian? Does it feel American? How do we use the least amount of lines? How do we show that it's, these are glasses? Because I think we didn't have the reflection on the glasses originally. Yeah. And it looked kind of dead. And we were okay, we had to put reflection in the glasses. And then it just, we had individual teeth because he's got real Tic Tac teeth.
Yeah.
If you look at photos of him, but then it looked really creepy. It looked like a skull. And so we're okay, the Tic Tac teeth isn't working.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of what is realistic Tic Tac teeth, but versus what do we associate with? And the big jovial smiles, presidential, but we're really trying to do the Rough Rider. So there's a lot of that. And then not to mention color, because the slouch hat has a sort of Australian outback color to it. We also wanted to include red, white, and blue. A lot of, we felt denim was or slate blue is what we're calling it. Would be a good color to sort of give it that blue collar, can-do work ethic. So very work clothes, get into work clothes, denim, khaki. And then having to balance it with, you have too many colors and you got a problem. So this one is actually on the higher side. It's got 6 colors, which is higher than we normally would go. It might be the highest for team identity, but it was, it was tough.
It's interesting to hear what you say about basing the logo on caricatures of Teddy Roosevelt rather than Teddy Roosevelt himself. It kind of reminds me of it's easier to imitate somebody's speech pattern once you hear it imitated. When Dana Carvey started doing Jimmy Stewart, everyone suddenly had a Jimmy Stewart impression, right? Because you heard the caricature, and then that or George Bush, right? When Will Ferrell started doing George Bush, how those speech patterns became so recognizable. So that's a really fascinating sort of visual connection to that phenomenon, I think.
Now, the trivia, what everybody wants to know, what's with the batting stance with,
it's a little bit
with Teddy Roosevelt? I will leave it to people to go. I don't want to say it explicitly, but Teddy Roosevelt had a perspective on baseball, which you can Google.
Interesting.
And said perspective would lead you to believe that if he ever picked up a bat and tried to play the game, he probably wouldn't know what to do.
That's very funny.
And so this is our tribute to if Teddy Roosevelt, real Teddy Roosevelt, knowing sort of how he related to baseball and his perspective on baseball, you would realize that if you asked him to play baseball, this is the pose he'd look. This is exactly what it looked like.
Before I let you get out of here, Jason, I want to ask you about the type, though, because you mentioned the type's a big part of this brand, or I guess I should say the script here. Obviously, the double R's is the double R logo is a prominent one, but it's, this is a little bit different from, some of the other baseball scripts. It's sort of evocative of a time period. What was your thinking in developing this script?
Yeah, I think, and it's how we approach script baseball lettering in general is, usually the character-driven hats, they sell the best, they sell better than letters, hands down. We've talked about that. If you're a kid in, I don't know, if you're a kid in San Diego and you're like, hey, we want to be a little league team, and the only letter from that team is an S, for example, you're gonna be like, or not an S, but like a C. You're like, C, like we're in San Diego, like, I like that team, but I'm not going to wear it. The C has no relevance. So that's why caps are very character driven, because of little league sales, or youth baseball sales, I should say. And so we try to make jersey lettering a little more major league. And I think the question that we always ask, just so it doesn't feel completely circusy, right? We want like there sort of be this balance. And I think one of the questions we always ask is, where is the Venn diagram lap over between what we consider like a Major League Baseball jersey lettering or script and the story? And in this instance with the RoughRiders, there were sort of three Venn diagrams. It was like Major League Baseball meets Teddy Roosevelt's sort of era, like what would be appropriate for that time period. And then also like Texas. And it was like, what is the sweet spot between like something, sort of like the Oakland A's, the Baltimore Orioles, classic MLB script, something that was, of Teddy Roosevelt's era. And then how do we bring like a sort of like Texas flair to it? And so that's how we landed on it.
And you had to use the star because it's Texas and that's the law.
I mean, it is the law. Like when we signed the contract, like that was point number one. It was not even an addendum or amendment. It was point number one. Yeah.
Well, Jason, now that I have been to San Diego, been to the Brandio studios, I really wish that we were having this conversation at Stone Brewing.
Yeah.
Right there. Like, what is it? Less than a quarter mile?
I could literally throw my laptop at it. Like,
don't throw your laptop at it because you're doing a lot of important work out there, and we need that laptop out there in the minor league baseball world. But no, these conversations are always so much fun. There's so much that goes into these brands, and I love hearing these stories.
And one thing I will say to the credit of the whole Riders organization, when we come up with a brand, candidly, we're often thinking about, is this concept does it require too much of the staff to implement, right? Because sometimes you have ideas and you're like, listen, we're going to go back to San Diego, we're on other projects. We're not going to be working full-time, living, eating, and breathing it every day. Is this a concept that's too complicated for the staff to run with? And man, a whole brand around Teddy Roosevelt is like a huge ask, right? That's a huge ask. Because like, when you're like in minor league baseball, you're getting into promotions, you're getting into marketing, you're not thinking like, I'm getting into the assignment of creating a whole brand every day around Teddy Roosevelt. And I will give the staff like the incredible amount of credit. Like they had like, early on they had like Teddy Tuesdays, or like they have like wisdom of quotes from Teddy Roosevelt that were like motivational sort of like personal development things. Yeah. Where people were like, yeah, that guy has some good things to say. Right. And just like, sort of like, picking yourself up by your bootstraps and like hard work and never giving up and just real sort of, it was sort of like a Texas vibe to it, which was fun. Yeah. They had a lot of like murals and paintings of the era and of Teddy and, fun stuff with quotes around the stadium. And it just was like, they really owned it. Just the whole thing is just, it's hard to do. And they did it great.
I remember when I was writing the story in sportslogos.net about this brand way back when. I remember that there was they had the store was the Riders Outpost, and they have a restaurant there called the Bull Moose Saloon. And there was just sort of like I remember there are photos in that article that just had like the team colors like throughout the ballpark. And so, I've never been. I would like to get to a game there, but I can see from the photos and what I hear about the ballpark that what you're saying is spot on. So, Jason, thank you again. It's so great to have you back on the podcast. And thanks as always for being so generous with your time in person and on Zoom.
My pleasure. Let's do it again soon.
We absolutely will. Thank you, Jason. All right, everyone, welcome back. I'm very pleased for the very first time on the Baseball by Design podcast to be welcoming a president of the United States. I am joined right now by Theodore Roosevelt himself. Mr. President, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Caputo. I'm delighted to be with you and your listeners for the duration of the interview. I wish you would call me as my friends call me, Colonel. From my brief time in the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, history knows us as the Rough Riders, and I do believe that is not unrelated to the topic of our conversation today.
Well, Colonel, it's absolutely what we're going to be talking about. I would love to know, from your perspective as a Rough Rider, as the leader of the Rough Riders themselves. First of all, if you would, just tell me, who were the Rough Riders and what did you all do?
The Rough Riders, that was a popular name given to my regiment by the press and by the people of the country at the time of the Spanish-American War. At the outset of the conflict with Spain over the freedom of the people of Cuba, I was the Assistant Secretary of the United States Navy. I wanted to resign my position, which I did, to take up a position that would allow me to get into the front lines of the battle. Congress passed a resolution that provided for 4 volunteer regiments to be raised across the country, and I was offered command of the 1st Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. I, in a rare moment of professional humility, requested that my friend, Colonel Leonard Wood, the White House surgeon for whom Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri would eventually be named, he'd been in at the capture of Geronimo in the Southwest, and I thought he could lead the regiment, and I might, as a captain previously in the New York National Guard, I might require a week or 2 of combat experience in order to lead the regiment. We famously trained in San Antonio, Texas, a harum-scarum bunch by statute, men from the Southwestern Territories, Arizona Territory, New Mexico Territory, Indian and Oklahoma Territory. But when the regiment was expanded, I was able to accept some of the 20,000 volunteers who had written to me by letter and telegram to join the regiment, and that included men from Harvard and Princeton and Yale, many of whom had played baseball in those Ivy League colleges. And we trained in San Antonio, shipped off to Tampa, Florida, and then about 2/3 of my regiment, without their horses for lack of transport, made the trip to Cuba. My crowded hour, July 1st, 1898, the Battle of Kettle Hill and the broader Battle of San Juan Heights. In a way, I was a war hero of the Spanish-American War. That fall, it led to my election as governor of the Empire State. After my 2-year term, the Republican bosses decided to kick me out to a place from which I might never be heard from again, the vice presidency of the United States. And sadly, within 6 months of our inauguration in March of 1901, in September of 1901, President McKinley was shot at the Buffalo Exposition in September 6th, 1901. And upon his death on September 14th, I became the 26th President of the United States. A route rising like a rocket that never would have occurred but for the less than 6 months that I spent first as Lieutenant Colonel and then Colonel of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders.
Well, Colonel, you were a sickly child. It's well documented. You had severe asthma and you were not well as a child, which you eventually were able to turn around, and you had you believed in physical exertion, and sports and athletics became important to you. Why was sport and physical activity important to you in your lifetime?
When I was a boy of 11 years old, weak and sickly with asthma, so much smaller than the other boys my age, my father, Theodore Roosevelt, the greatest man I ever knew, he called me into his study for a heart-to-heart talk. I knew the seriousness of the subject to follow, for rather than calling me by the diminutive nickname by which I was known in the family, TD, he said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. Without the aid of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it otherwise should. It is hard work and drudgery, but you must make your body." I said, "Father, I shall." And I set out to make my body with calisthenics. I lifted weights, I swam, I rowed, I worked on the parallel bars and on the rings. I even took boxing lessons in the classical manner, and I built my body. And it does appear I may have overdone it just a bit. My father led the family on long horseback rides, long hikes, first out at Long Branch along the Jersey seashore, later along the Hudson River and in the Adirondacks, and ultimately out in Oyster Bay, Long Island, where we had a summer home called Tranquility. Life there was anything but tranquil. There was so much outdoor activity, swimming, rowing boats. I eventually built a home at Oyster Bay and so enjoyed rowing boats that I would row across Long Island Sound all the way to Rye, New York and back, a trip of some 30 miles round trip, rowing in the choppy seas on the Sound. I was shot in the chest in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, October 14th, 1912. I was then a man, 54 years old, almost 55. I was taken to the hospital in Mercy Hospital in Chicago. The doctor there who examined me said he'd never seen such a powerful chest on a man. I think from years of rowing and other outdoor activities, wood chopping and such. But with regards to sport, my brother Elliot, whom we called Nell in the family, in history, he would be Eleanor Roosevelt's father. He and I, as young boys, contested all the time foot races, long jumps, who could climb a hill the quickest. I do believe in sport, but I believe in sport as game, as pleasure. Now, I did not think that sports should be professional. I liked amateur sports, and I do believe that during my time, and perhaps even more so in the time hence, that sports as a profession, sports where we actually laud and magnify the achievements on the sporting field. Well, it was so very important for me that a man be well-rounded, show himself physically fit, but most importantly, so that when duty called upon him, he was physically able to perform those duties. You might know that as a result of a conference held at the White House in 1905, I influenced the beginning of the National Collegiate Athletic Association in 1906.
Well, so here we are in the 21st century, and there are at least 3 baseball teams that I can think of that are named for you or have your image in their branding, including the one we're discussing today, the Frisco RoughRiders. What was your particular connection with baseball in addition to these other sports?
I was really more of a football man, football being the big collegiate game during my lifetime. A close connection I had with baseball was from my youngest son, Quentin. He played, as I used to call the game, the 9. Quentin and his friends, the White House gang, would etch a field into the south lawn of the White House. Other neighborhood teams would come to play on the south lawn, and I was one of the ardent fans standing on the porch of the south portion of the White House, shouting out, "Hit it! Hit it!" The newspaper reporters enjoyed watching the game and would actually publish the box score of Quentin's White House gang and their opponents in the following newspaper. At the White House, I invited the championship teams to enjoy the hospitality of the White House. During my tenure, that included the Cleveland Naps, the New York Highlanders, which you would know as the New York Yankees, and also the Washington Senators. And this during the time of Walter Big Train Johnson being on the mound. I think perhaps the greatest pitcher of all time. The Georgia Peach, Ty Cobb, was brought to the White House and visited. So my connection with baseball, I did not ever throw out a first pitch. That was to be done by my successor, William Howard Taft.
Well, before I let you go, Colonel, I do want to ask you in regards to these Frisco RoughRiders. You've seen the branding. I understand that you've actually been to their ballpark for a game. What do you think of their representation of you in their logo, in their branding?
I was informed of the branding of the Rough Riders at the time that they most recently changed the logo. It had been a silhouetted Rough Rider, and that is a symbol very often used by teams that call themselves the Rough Riders. I was shown a new logo. It was a gentleman who seemed to be a bit overweight. Now, he was twisted up in a fashion. I think if you look at his follow-through, his feet are in the wrong direction, or his grip on the bat doesn't make sense with his stat, but he's a funny-looking fellow. Your listeners cannot see, but I've got my Frisco RoughRiders baseball cap, and I've got my Frisco RoughRiders T-shirt.
You certainly do.
The spectacles, the mustache, the grinning face. Well, that is sort of an iconic look from the time that I was police commissioner in New York, when the newspaper cartoonists would use just my glasses and my teeth as a symbol. And well, I think it's just a fine symbol.
Well, while the imagery of President Roosevelt swinging a baseball bat is a little contorted. It's it's not the best swing. He is appropriately carrying a big stick.
Well done, Mr. Caputo. It was in St. Paul, Minnesota, September 1st, Labor Day, 1901. I was yet vice president and could not know the fate that would befall President McKinley in Buffalo 5 days hence. I first quoted the old African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." In Africa, it meant that a man might travel from his own tribal region to and through other tribal regions and do so peacefully, unmolested, as long as he spoke diplomatically. But it helped if he had a big stick and looked like he knew how to use it too. For me, it's the Washingtonian concept of peace through strength, that the most effectual means to preserve the peace is to prepare for war. My speech was about the American Navy forward deployed, and how appropriate today that the USS Theodore Roosevelt, nuclear aircraft carrier, 5,000 Navy and Marine personnel aboard, is called by the Navy the Big Stick.
I love it. Well, Colonel, thank you for joining me. I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind handing over the microphone to your friend, Joe Wiegand.
I've been delighted to be with you. I look forward to seeing you down the trail. Mr. Wiegand, you're wanted by Mr. Caputo.
Joe.
Hi, Paul.
Hello. How nice to see you.
It's great to see you, sir.
And
Great to see your listeners, too.
Great to see our audio podcast listeners.
Yeah.
You are a first-person living history interpreter who portrays Teddy Roosevelt.
Isn't that a wonderfully strange thing to do as a profession? But Paul, it's a lot like my feelings for baseball. I would do it for free if I could. But as a kid growing up outside of Chicago in the suburbs, I couldn't hit the junk. Truth be told, I couldn't even hit the fastball. But if, like Rusty Staub, I could stick my head out in front of the plate, I'd wind up on third base.
There you go.
Love baseball. It's such a wonderful analogy for life.
Clearly, Teddy Roosevelt lives on in our collective memories, and obviously this is something that you're doing that's important to folks, and is going to carry on for as long as you want it to.
So we do say that Theodore Roosevelt is certainly Mount Rushmore worthy. He's very often estimated by historians, both American and there's an annual review of European historians of American history. And he's always ranked in the top 4 or top 5 of American presidents. The Nobel Peace Prize for settling the Russo-Japanese War, the building of the Panama Canal, the steaming around the world, the Great White Fleet, the first president to leave the United States during his term of office going to Panama. There are so many of these firsts, so many of the precedents that Theodore Roosevelt sets. The fact that he wasn't the first president to throw out a first pitch is almost a little lament, but his what he called the glory of work and the joy of living.
Yep.
And I think I might have told you my worlds came together when in 2016, my calendar allowed me to attend 6 of the 7 World Series games between the Chicago Cubs and then the Cleveland Indians. I took the Amtrak back and forth on a sleeper, which seemed so appropriate. The only game I missed was October 27th, Theodore Roosevelt's birthday. I was performing at his home at San Juan Hill, Oyster Bay, Long Island. I dressed up, Paul, in costume. I had a Cubs logo big on my jacket. 1908 with the Cubs logo was the 0. And I knew that every newspaper reporter and TV reporter 6 hours before the game would be looking for a story outside of the ballpark. And the lead wrote itself. The last time the Cubs won the World Series, Teddy Roosevelt was the president. The joy and elation I had in Cleveland, extra innings, Game 7, the Cubs win, and the Cubs fans, about 200 of us, congregated as the 10,000 Cleveland fans filtered out of the great square. I wasn't in the ballpark. I was outside with the working class fans, of which I consider myself one. And there was a Cubs fan standing next to me as big as a barn door. And I looked over to him and I said, if you put me on your shoulders, I'll give you $20. And he got down. I jumped on his shoulders. I had my W towel, and the color photo that went all over the world was Teddy Roosevelt flying the W. The good Lord could have called me home like Harry Carey, just as sure as, the good Lord made little green apples. The Cubs were going to win the World Series someday. So I even almost get teary-eyed thinking about the emotion and elation I felt for generations of Cubs fans who never got to experience that moment, but I did, as Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, how fun is that?
That's pretty incredible. I can understand you, Joe, the Cubs fan, really relishing that moment, irrespective of the fact that Teddy Roosevelt himself was more a football guy than a baseball guy, which I learned recently.
When I look at the energy and the capital invested in the sports industry, I do think that Theodore Roosevelt would be calling upon the American people to perhaps consider that energy and that investment and take that to some of the problem solving that we need in this country, because I do believe that's what Theodore Roosevelt, the man that means so much to me and the American people, would have us do.
Well, that is very well said, and I very much appreciate that sentiment. Joe, so great to catch up with you again. We go way back, and so it's nice to see you again, and I hope we get to catch up again soon. In the meantime, where can folks go see the work that you do online, and how can people reach you?
Thanks kindly, Paul. TeddyRooseveltShow.com is a great place to keep up with my calendar. I do tour the country, and I'm blessed to be every summer in Medora, North Dakota. Medora.com is the website for tickets to the Teddy Roosevelt Show. I lead daily hikes up our point-to-point park. We're the gateway to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, a region of which Theodore Roosevelt wrote, "This is where the romance of his life began." And Paul, we're actually building a Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, a $300 million project planned to open July 4th, 2026, our semi-quincentennial of the America 250 celebration. In the spirit of one of my heroes, Ernie Banks, with the hope that we might do this again, all I can say, Paul, is thank you, and let's play 2.
Joe, thank you so much. What a blast. All of that contact information will be in the show notes. In the meantime, like I said, there's more teams out there named for Teddy Roosevelt. We'll find a chance to do this again.
Godspeed. All the best to you and your listeners. Thanks, Paul.
It is time once again for your favorite, my favorite segment on Baseball by Design, Studio Simon Stumpers with my friend, Dan Simon. I have to admit, when I logged on this morning, a little startled to see you in what appears to my eyes to be an oversized flat brim cap with your George Washington swinging an axe logo from the Fred Nats on it. So I have a feeling that is because 2 of the next 3 Studio Simon Stumpers that we're going to be recording have to do with presidents.
Yes, there definitely is a theme. And with regard to the oversized part of it, when New Era sends samples, for whatever reason, it's always a 7.5, and a size 7.5, that is. And that is not my size. My bean is a little smaller than that. So I feel like I'm like Charlie Brown right now with that oversized hat on my head. But yeah, it's part of our theme for 2 of our Stumper recordings today. So yep, and let's get to it.
So it's a little inside baseball there. We're letting on that sometimes we record these in batches here. Today's episode is about the Frisco RoughRiders, a presidential theme for sure. So let's I'm assuming this has something to do with Teddy Roosevelt, who seems to be popping up on minor league baseball logos like all over the place these days.
Well, for good reason. He was not just a president, but I think one of the most fascinating figures in the history of our country. So, and of course, he is immortalized on Mount Rushmore. And we've heard a lot, if you're a sports fan, which I'm sure 99 out of 100 Baseball by Design listeners are, if not 100 out of 100. You've heard about, who's on the Yankees Mount Rushmore, who's on the Dallas Cowboys Mount Rushmore. So you being a Philadelphia Phillies fan, just out of curiosity, who's on your Philadelphia Phillies Mount Rushmore?
Richie Ashburn, Mike Schmidt, Ryan Howard, and is it too soon to say Bryce Harper? Maybe Chase Utley instead of Bryce Harper. That's who Richie Ashburn, Mike Schmidt, Ryan Howard, Chase Utley.
A good list. There is a notable omission there.
Steve Carlton.
Steve Carlton. We're talking about a man, not only a Hall of Famer, but 4 Cy Youngs. Not a lot of pitchers have done that. So
yeah,
to me, Mike Schmidt and Steve Carlton are givens, and then the other ones, everyone you mentioned is certainly one worthy of at least mention, if not inclusion. You also have some that people don't necessarily think of right away. Grover Cleveland Alexander, also known as Pete Alexander, played the first 7 years of his 20-year career with the Phillies. Led the league in wins 5 times, including 3 30-win seasons. So, a great pitcher. Then you also have Chuck Klein, somebody who people don't necessarily think of immediately with the Phillies, but another Hall of Famer, played 15 years with the Phillies. Led the league in home runs 4 times, RBIs 2 times, hits twice, batting once, won an MVP and finished second in the MVP 2 other times. It's a pretty darn good player who doesn't get his due as far as mention for the Phillies Mount Rushmore. But here's a little bit more about Mount Rushmore, on which the subject of today's baseball identity is carved. That subject, of course, Theodore Roosevelt. Mount Rushmore was sculpted by a man named Gutzon Borglum, an interesting name, but his parents were Danish immigrants, so that explains the origin of that name. Now, Mr. Borglum, Gutzon Borglum, did not do the sculpting himself. There were about 400 men that were involved in the creation of Mount Rushmore. The work on the project began in 1927 and continued until Borglum's death in 1941. But this is not just about carving into the side of a mountain. There is a baseball connection here. Gutzon Borglum's son, Lincoln Borglum, loved baseball, and he formed a baseball team made up of the Mount Rushmore workers. They would play other company teams around the area. Now, this team would have to have had a name. And so our studio Simon Stumper today asks, what was the name of the Mount Rushmore team? Was it A, the Mount Rushmore Carvers, B, the Mount Rushmore Blasters, or C, the Mount Rushmore Drillers? So again, Carvers, Blasters, or Drillers.
So Mount Rushmore is about a 4 to 5 hour drive from where I live here in Fort Collins. I have done that drive. I have made the visit up there, and it's a beautiful place up in the Black Hills up there. It's a beautiful spot to go drive around, go camping, go hiking. I can tell you from my experience there, I remember that the primary method that they used to create Mount Rushmore was by blasting. They were using dynamite to essentially, I mean, they were carving away the rock, but they were using dynamite to do it. So I understand that you could probably create a baseball-ish double entendre out of carvers and drillers. But the most obvious one to me is, you're blasting a home run and you're also blasting the rock away to carve Mount Rushmore. So I'm going to go with the Mount Rushmore Blasters.
That would have made for the best name, if you ask me. And my reasoning is the same as your reasoning. It makes a lot of sense. And what you said is indeed the case. As a matter of fact, I don't have the number in front of me, but in my research in this, they talked about how many tons of blasted rock were blasted off of the face of this mountain. And it all lies, or the great majority of it still lies there at the base of the mountain. It's a lot of rock to have to move and get out of there. So I've not visited Mount Rushmore, but I've seen the photos, and all this broken up rock is all there in piles at the bottom of the mountain. So blasters would make sense, but of course there was carving and drilling that went on. There were people of all different skills that had to be involved in the creation of this wonderful monument. And drilling was included, and they were the Mount Rushmore drillers. Now, this team was not just a bunch of guys playing together for fun. Lincoln Borglum, the son of Gutzon Borglum, was such a big baseball fan that at a certain point he made athletic ability sort of a determining factor when deciding who would be hired to work on the mountain. If you could play, you stood a better chance of getting a job working on the mountain. And in 1937, the Mount Rushmore drillers competed in the South Dakota State Amateur Baseball Tournament and finished now either second or third in the tournament. Now, when I say second or third, that's because the internet does not always have definitive answers on things. And I've seen several posts, stories, articles that mentioned them finishing third, and then also several that said they finished second. They made it to the championship game. Whether it was second or third, I don't know. But the point is, they were good enough to finish, in the top three throughout the entire state of South Dakota amateur baseball ranks. So it was some good baseball by some very talented people who I'm just amazed by how you can take a mountain and make it look so much like these presidents.
Yeah.
You're not working with a little chisel and you're talking with the whole side of a mountain. It's a feat that I think is pretty amazing.
I will say that while they were good at carving mountains, they were bad at choosing baseball team names, because with all due respect to the Tulsa Drillers, the Mount Rushmore Blasters would have been a much better name. So I acknowledge I'm not gonna challenge the results of this Studio Simon Stumper, but I will say I agree with you. Would have been a better name to go Mount Rushmore Blasters.
Let's finish up with a did you know? Did you know that Mount Rushmore is actually unfinished? Each of the presidents was meant to also have a body carved out of the mountain, but upon I believe the reason it stopped because of lack of funding. But the reason for lack of funding was the funding was not ongoing. They had a certain amount of money, and at some point they ran out, and there was still a lot of carving left to go. It started in 1927, finished in 1941, which is when Gutzon Borglum died. That's 14 years, and they were maybe half done. So you can understand how the funding would run out. But it would have been, I've actually seen a picture of a small scale, Borglum made a small sculpture of what the whole thing would have looked like. And there's their, coats and everything. And it was actually kind of cool to see that.
I want to imagine that the bodies were real tiny, that they were like little bobblehead looking presidents.
Or like a lot of the characters I do in the brand identities I do for minor league baseball teams.
I'm picturing 4 Kannapolis cannonballers next to each other there. That's how I want to envision the bodies on on Mount Rushmore. Well, Dan, this is why this is everyone's favorite segment on Baseball by Design. Thank you so much. And I know there's more to come. So we will see you next week right back here in the basement in Fort Collins, Colorado, or you live from Louisville with all of those flat brim 7.5 size hats right behind you there. We'll see you next week.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. And I might, given the theme of our next one, I might be wearing this very same hat.
We'll see. How embarrassing would it be to be wearing the exact same thing for 2 episodes in a row?
I shudder at the thought of the embarrassment. Okay, Paul, have a good one. See you next week.
See you next week.